Hi, I'm Tucker, and welcome to Last Moments. And in today's video, I'm looking at moments where amusement park rides go wrong, from a moment of overconfidence in a children's play area that ended instantly to a routine water ride that became a confined space with no way out.
It was November 4th, 2013. The midday heat at a popular Mumbai amusement park pressed down on crowded pathways as thousands of visitors moved between attractions. Ravi Deshmukh, a 39-year-old food vendor, stood behind his fried snack stall. Ravi had operated seasonal food stalls for 6 years, moving between festivals, fairs, and amusement parks across Maharashtra. He specialized in fried street snacks, working 12-hour shifts during peak seasons to support his wife and 2 children in Pune. He had learned the trade from a cousin and picked up equipment maintenance through trial and error, never receiving formal training in gas system installation or safety protocols. The amusement park contracted him seasonally, valuing his low overhead costs and popular menu items. The park had previously allowed seasonal vendors to store spare cylinders under counters, despite local safety codes requiring certified connectors, leak detection, and annual inspections. Propane food vending demands proper pressure regulation, threaded connections, and leak detection. Being heavier than air, leaks pool in low areas. Concentrations of 2.1 to 9.5% are explosive near ignition sources, although odorized frying and crowd noise masked the smell. That morning brought unusually heavy crowds. By 12:30 in the afternoon, Ravi had already served over 200 orders when his primary propane tank ran empty during a surge of customers. Rather than closing temporarily, he immediately retrieved a replacement cylinder from storage. Working quickly in the cramped space beneath his serving counter, he threaded the connector onto the tank valve. Investigators later determined the fitting had resisted during installation, but Ravi continued tightening it, applying extra pressure. The connector had actually cross-threaded, not fully seated, leaking slowly into the enclosed lower compartment. He turned on the gas supply without performing a leak check, despite standard safety practices requiring one. Propane began escaping immediately into the enclosed lower compartment of his stall. The odor was faint, masked by cooking smells and poor ventilation. Within 8 minutes, explosive concentrations had built up in the confined space. At 12:47 in the afternoon, Ravi reached down to ignite his second fryer. The electric starter spark from the fryer element created a single spark. The accumulated propane ignited instantly in a violent deflagration. Witnesses described a bright orange flash, followed by a sharp cracking boom as the stall frame jolted upward under the pressure wave. The blast came from the propane air cloud. The cylinder was thrown by the pressure wave. The metal frame buckled outward as canvas walls disintegrated. Ravi was thrown backward 3 feet by the blast wave. His exposed skin blackened and clothing ignited. The explosion sent the propane tank tumbling into the crowd. Metal fragments and structural debris struck 2 guests standing 6 feet away. One suffered a severe leg laceration from flying sheet metal. The other sustained a fractured wrist and facial burns. Ravi collapsed beside the destroyed stall, his airways severely damaged by superheated gases. Nearby vendors immediately began shouting for help as smoke billowed upward. A vendor operating an adjacent beverage stand grabbed his radio and contacted park security. The park's fire suppression team arrived with extinguishers and medical supplies. City Fire Brigade units reached the scene moments later with advanced equipment and paramedics. Despite immediate treatment, Ravi died at the scene from catastrophic thermal injuries to his respiratory system and chest. The medical examiner determined he had inhaled flames directly, causing fatal damage to his lungs and airway. The amusement park implemented mandatory gas safety training and certification for all food vendors the following season. Local news coverage appeared briefly in a weekend safety feature but generated little public attention. It was August 14, 2015. The pre-dawn silence at an amusement park in Vienna carried an unusual stillness. Friedrich Lang, a 34-year-old technician known for his methodical approach to safety, had arrived early for a routine inspection. Friedrich had worked at the park for 6 years, quietly building a reputation as the technician who handled the jobs others avoided. He specialized in testing high-speed rotating rides. The Orbit Spinner was one of these, 8 mechanical arms extending from a central hub, each arm carrying a 2-person seat that rotated independently, While the entire structure spun, Friedrich likely understood the ride's complexity, its hydraulic restraint system, emergency stop mechanisms, and the critical importance of lockout and tag-out procedures that prevented accidental activation during maintenance. Colleagues said that he knew management sometimes pressured staff to test rides with technicians in seats when replacement parts were delayed, and that practice influenced his decision that morning. That morning, Friedrich arrived at 6:15 a.m. with his personal toolkit and inspection notebook. A maintenance notice from the previous day had flagged a faulty control relay, but the replacement part hadn't arrived. Management approved testing the hydraulic restraints manually, bypassing normal lockout procedures to save time before the park's 10 a.m. opening. The emergency stop system had been temporarily disconnected with a control panel jumper authorized verbally by management. The park stretched empty and quiet under morning light, polished metal reflecting the sun's first rays. Friedrich climbed into seat number 4, positioned at the end of a 20-foot mechanical arm, to test the restraint's manual release function. The ride's main power was supposed to be isolated, but the faulty relay remained energized in the control panel. His co-worker, Jens Meyer, stood near the central platform, monitoring the inspection. Friedrich adjusted the hydraulic restraint across his lap, checking its tension and release mechanism. The restraint functioned normally, but the moment Friedrich shifted his weight, the faulty relay triggered. The orbit spinner's main motor activated without warning. The central hub lurched into motion. Friedrich's arm swung outward violently as the entire structure began its programmed rotation cycle. The hydraulic restraint locked automatically, designed to secure riders during normal operation. Now it trapped Friedrich against the seat as the arm accelerated to full speed. His legs struck the outer steel support frame within seconds. Jens screamed and ran toward the control booth, but the emergency stop button had been disconnected during the bypass procedure. The ride completed its standard 90-second cycle, spinning Friedrich in repeated circles. Each rotation smashed his legs against the steel framework. His arms flailed against the surrounding structure. The centrifugal force compressed his chest against the locked restraint. The mechanical arms continued their programmed pattern, forcing Friedrich's lower body against the steel framework with each pass. The polished metal bore the evidence of each impact. After completing 5 full rotations, another technician reached the main circuit breaker located in a locked electrical room and cut all power. The ride coasted to a stop. Friedrich's body slumped in the seat, restrained and motionless. Park security called emergency services at 6:18 a.m. Paramedics arrived 9 minutes later. Friedrich was declared dead at the scene, his body exhibiting severe crush injuries to both legs, multiple skeletal fractures, and catastrophic internal trauma consistent with sustained high-force impact over approximately 90 seconds. The ride was immediately shut down. Investigation revealed the delayed relay replacement, inadequate lockout enforcement, and management pressure to complete testing before opening. The park privately compensated the family, while a formal inquiry by workplace safety authorities continued. It was July 14, 2016, at an amusement park in Missouri. Families moved between attractions as the park's vintage narrow-gauge railway carried visitors through wooded sections of the grounds. Hanson Bricks, a 31-year-old warehouse worker, had driven over from his shift at a regional storage facility about 10 miles away. His sister later told investigators that Hanson rarely went to amusement parks and almost declined the trip, but he agreed after his niece insisted he come along. He wore a stainless steel bracelet that had belonged to their father, who had died several years earlier. The band had loosened over time, and throughout the day, Hanson kept adjusting it while waiting in ride lines, joking that losing it would feel like losing the last thing his dad had given him. The family spent most of the afternoon exploring the park's attractions, with Hanson accompanying his nephew and niece from ride to ride. Around 5:10 in the afternoon, their group stepped off the narrow-gauge sightseeing train after completing the scenic loop through the wooded sections of the park. The locomotive and 2 passenger cars had just pulled into the station when Hanson suddenly felt the bracelet slip from his wrist. He watched it fall onto the ballast gravel between the rails about 6 feet from the platform edge. A nearby sign clearly warned guests not to enter the track area, and a ride attendant was preparing the train for its next departure. Instead of asking staff to retrieve it, Hanson waved off his sister and said he would grab it real quick. Without alerting staff, Hanson stepped down from the platform and walked about 18 feet along the track bed toward the bracelet. Witnesses later said the attendant shouted for him to get off the tracks, but Hanson continued anyway. The next train had already been dispatched around the loop, and was approaching the station. The locomotive and passenger cars moved at roughly 8 miles per hour along the straight section leading to the platform. Hansen crouched between the rails, facing away from the incoming train while searching through the loose gravel. As the train cleared the trees, the engineer noticed movement on the track and immediately sounded the horn from roughly 120 feet away. Hansen remained focused on the ground and did not react. He stood up with the bracelet in his hand and turned to step away. His right foot slipped into a shallow depression in the ballast beside the rail. When he tried to pull back, the heel caught against the rail base while the front of his shoe wedged between the rail and the wooden tie beneath it. Witnesses saw him tug upward repeatedly, struggling to free his foot as people on the platform shouted for him to move. The locomotive reached him moments later. The front pilot plate struck his pelvis, knocking him backward onto the rails before the leading wheel assembly rolled across his lower body. The train stopped about 20 feet past the impact point. Park staff used a mechanical jack stored near the station to lift the locomotive enough to remove him from beneath the axle. Emergency responders confirmed fatal injuries caused by severe pelvic crushing and blood loss. The bracelet was still clenched in his hand. Investigators later determined Hansen had deliberately entered the restricted track area despite posted warning signs and staff instructions. The train ride remained closed for the rest of the day while the track area was inspected. Officials later noted that park staff routinely retrieved dropped items from the tracks for guests, something that would have taken less than a minute if Hansen had simply asked for help. It was August 9, 2015, when 28-year-old Lila Chapman arrived at a seaside amusement park in Santa Cruz, California, with 3 co-workers for what should have been a perfect summer afternoon. Lila worked in food service and was known for her adventurous spirit, always the first to suggest trying new restaurants or activities. Her companions included Jenna, a 30-year-old server with an outgoing personality who could make friends anywhere, Omar, a 27-year-old warehouse worker whose meticulous nature made him notice details others missed, and Chris, a 31-year-old substitute educator whose cautious demeanor often balanced the group's more impulsive decisions. The group had received an unexpected afternoon off due to a last-minute schedule change and decided to hit the park's largest inverted roller coaster first. The weather was perfect with clear skies and a light coastal breeze, and the ride was running continuous cycles with no delays. As they approached the loading platform, Omar's keen eye caught a faint squeaking sound coming from their train during test dispatches, but operations continued normally. A small placard near the station read "Test cycle completed, cleared for operation," indicating recent maintenance work. What the riders didn't know was that morning maintenance had adjusted the over-the-shoulder restraint sensors, and this particular coaster model operated without secondary seatbelts. Lila was assigned to the front left seat. When the operator performed the routine push check, her harness latched at a lower detent than typical, creating a visibly larger chest clearance. A second operator confirmed restraint lights as part of the standard dual check procedure. However, the miscalibrated sensor registered this gap as acceptable, and the panel indicators showed all restraints verified, allowing dispatch. The train rolled out smoothly with the familiar sound of anti-rollback dogs clicking on the lift hill. After cresting the 180-foot drop, the coaster pulled high G-forces through a zero-G roll. During these early maneuvers, Lila's over-the-shoulder restraint exhibited slight upward movement within the latch mechanism due to vibration and the initial excessive gap. As the train entered the first vertical loop, peak upward acceleration occurred with riders inverted at the apex. The restraint's ratchet pawl, which had been marginally engaged due to the starting gap, allowed a momentary climb by 1 increment under the dynamic load. This small movement was enough to compromise the restraint's effectiveness. Lila's hips cleared the seat pan, and despite her forearms striking the seat wing, she separated completely from the restraint system. Her trajectory intersected with a support crossmember adjacent to the loop structure, before she impacted the ground within the restricted area below. The remaining riders immediately began shouting as they witnessed the horrific event unfold. The train continued its programmed course until reaching the next block break, where the operator executed an emergency stop. Emergency medical services arrived quickly and initiated advanced life support protocols, but Lila had sustained catastrophic blunt force trauma, including cervical spine dislocation, multiple rib fractures with lung injuries, severe traumatic brain injury, and rapid internal hemorrhaging. Despite all efforts, she was pronounced dead at the scene. The investigation revealed that the combination of the restraint position sensor and the absence of a secondary belt system on this coaster model had created the conditions for this tragedy. The root cause was traced to a tolerance stack-up in the restraint's position sensor calibration, which allowed the system to register a partially latched harness as fully secured. The affected train was immediately removed from service, and all restraint assemblies, sensor calibration records, and dispatch logs were secured as evidence. The park suspended operations on the ride pending a complete safety review and recalibration of all restraint systems. It was August 9, 2016. The morning air at the mountain resort in Shizuoka Prefecture was humid and still, with temperatures already climbing toward 85 degrees. Ryo Tanaka, a 27-year-old contract IT worker from Tokyo. Ryo was a programmer for a mid-tier software company, but weekends transformed him into something different. For 3 years, he'd been obsessed with capturing POV footage from roller coasters, despite having fewer than 200 followers on his video channel. Friends described him as cautious at work, but increasingly reckless during leisure time, often ignoring posted safety rules to get better camera angles. Roller coasters subject riders to forces exceeding 4 Gs while traveling at speeds up to 80 miles per hour through inversions, drops, and sharp turns designed to push human tolerance limits. Modern safety systems include multiple restraint mechanisms, height restrictions, and strict policies prohibiting loose articles. That morning, he'd concealed a collapsible metal selfie stick inside his jacket sleeve, securing it with electrical tape to avoid detection during bag checks. The hypercoaster's 200-foot first drop was exactly what Ryo wanted for his footage. Security footage later revealed him collapsing the telescoping stick to approximately 18 inches and taping it along his forearm before entering the station. Ride attendants conducted standard visual safety checks, confirming his over-the-shoulder restraints were properly secured. Multiple witnesses seated behind him recalled Ryo shifting repeatedly in his seat, appearing to adjust something inside his jacket as the train climbed the lift hill. At the peak, 200 feet above ground, Ryo prepared for his stunt. As the train crested and began its 80-mile-per-hour descent, he forcefully extended the selfie stick sideways to capture the drop. The metal shaft immediately struck a fixed steel support beam during the initial acceleration phase. The sudden impact violently wrenched his extended arm backward, causing a catastrophic shoulder dislocation. The selfie stick snapped at its telescoping joint, and the fractured end whipped backward, striking Ryo along the side of the neck and lower jaw with blunt force. The secondary impact fractured cervical vertebrae and lacerated major blood vessels, leading to rapid and uncontrolled bleeding. Blood spread across the seat, restraints, and nearby riders as Ryo slumped forward, losing consciousness within seconds. The automated train continued its programmed cycle, while passengers screamed in horror. Emergency crews reached the station within 4 minutes of the train's return, but Ryo had already died from massive blood loss and neurological trauma. The coroner determined death resulted from catastrophic blunt force neck trauma, vascular rupture, and severe orthopedic injuries to the shoulder and arm, leading to rapid hemorrhage and loss of consciousness. The park immediately implemented enhanced physical screening of riders, targeted metal detection checks during peak periods, and revised staff training focused on identifying concealed objects. It was July 14, 2014, at a local water park in San Antonio, Texas. The afternoon heat pushed crowds toward water rides, where shouting, rushing water, and constant motion blended. The River Rapids attraction was known for soaking riders, not flipping rafts or trapping bodies beneath the current. Alyssa Moreno was 20, a community college student in Laredo finishing nursing prerequisites while working weekends at a daycare to cover books and fees. Friends knew her as quiet and easygoing, rarely seeking attention. That July trip was her first vacation without family, squeezed between extra shifts and a tight budget, leaving everyone tired, sunburned, and filming casually. By early afternoon, they lined up for the Rapids ride. It was a basic circular raft attraction, 6 molded seats, individual lap restraints, and water churning through concrete channels. Signs at the entrance warned riders to stay seated, Keep restraints fastened and distribute weight evenly. The operator slowed the loading process and pointed out that 3 riders were sitting on one side. He asked them to spread out properly and reminded them to keep their restraints fastened. They shifted slightly, still uneven, joked about it, and waved him off. A bystander near the railing recorded them as the raft drifted away from the platform. The raft entered the channel, spinning through shallow drops. It bumped and splashed like normal. Water flow was running at a higher setting typical for peak summer crowds, making the raft move faster through wider sections. As the ride slowed near a bend, Alyssa deliberately unbuckled her lap restraint. Ignoring the posted warnings, she stood halfway up from her seat so everyone could fit into a group selfie. One of the riders reached toward her, but she laughed and steadied herself with one hand on the raft rim. The other hand held a phone. The channel ahead widened into a straight stretch where currents crossed. The raft rotated sideways and hesitated. Other riders later said it looked wrong, like it stalled instead of spinning. The current caught the raft broadside. It snapped hard toward the outer wall and flipped without warning. All 6 riders were thrown into the water when the raft overturned. 3 surfaced right away, coughing and grabbing the concrete edge. 2 others broke free moments later and pulled themselves toward the side. Alyssa did not come back up. The raft settled low in the channel, held down by the force of the moving water, its underside pressed flat against the floor. Investigators found the raft turned sideways and lodged in a widened channel, where uneven water pressure built beneath it. High flow, uneven weight, and a disengaged lap restraint caused it to flip and stay pinned. Witnesses saw Alyssa's arms stop moving first. Operators cut power, but the water pressure eased seconds too late. Alyssa surfaced unresponsive. Lifeguards pulled them out and called for help. Paramedics arrived in about 7 minutes, attempted CPR, and continued resuscitation during transport. Alyssa was pronounced dead shortly after reaching the hospital. The medical examiner ruled the cause of death as drowning. Her lungs were filled with water. Bruising across her chest and shoulders showed sustained pressure, consistent with being pinned underwater. There were no fatal head injuries or internal damage. Loss of consciousness was attributed to oxygen deprivation. The death was ruled accidental. The ride was shut down and modified weeks later. Alyssa's daycare closed for a day so co-workers could attend her funeral. Her nursing books were donated to a local scholarship fund. It was August 3, 2014. The California afternoon sun beat down on a packed regional theme park, where the screams of thrill-seekers mixed with carnival music. Ethan Marks, a 16-year-old from Anaheim, stood at the base of the Titan drop coaster, eyeing the 180-foot vertical climb. What should have been an ordinary summer day would end with paramedics arriving to a scene of catastrophic trauma. Ethan wasn't a troubled kid. He maintained a 3.8 GPA at his high school and volunteered at a local animal shelter. But he was obsessed with building his social media following. He'd gained a few hundred followers by photographing himself dangling from freeway overpasses and balanced on building ledges. His parents said that they knew about the account, but dismissed it as typical teenage attention-seeking. Theme park safety relies on multiple layers of protection, including restraint harnesses engineered to withstand extreme forces, surveillance cameras, and physical barriers designed to keep guests away from ride structures. Warning signs plastered every surface near restricted areas, clearly stating that climbing on rides resulted in immediate ejection and criminal trespassing charges. His friends said that he'd scouted the coaster for weeks, noticing that during loading sequences, cars sometimes remained paused at the apex, creating what he believed was enough time for a photo. That afternoon, Ethan separated from his friends, approaching the ride's exit pathway, where metal fencing created a barrier between guests and the ride's structural supports. 2 staff members were managing the loading platform 200 feet away. Ethan scaled the 6-foot chain-link fence, his phone clutched in one hand. He'd waited until a gate to a service pathway sat momentarily ajar, allowing him to bypass the normal barriers. 3 witnesses later reported seeing him climb the steel lattice framework supporting the track, moving with alarming speed toward the paused coaster car at the summit. A control room attendant glimpsed the climb on a camera feed and radioed the operator, who engaged the ride's emergency stop. The train remained locked at a block break at the apex. There was no safe, rapid procedure to retrieve someone hanging outside the restraints. Staff attempted to alert him from below, but the distance and ambient noise made communication ineffective. Ethan's friends watched from a distance, seeing him on the structure as he reached the coaster car side, approximately 180 feet above concrete maintenance pits. Positioning himself on the narrow maintenance catwalk beside the frozen coaster, Ethan leaned beyond the guardrail to frame the selfie. His sneaker lost traction on the narrow metal surface of the catwalk. His body twisted sideways, phone clattering away as both hands grasped for the railing. He caught it briefly, but momentum carried him backward. He fell from the structure before striking lower support beams. His body struck a horizontal steel crossbeam approximately 60 feet below. His body cartwheeled, striking 2 more support structures before landing face down in a maintenance pit containing hydraulic equipment. A ride operator called emergency services, and paramedics arrived within minutes but only pronounced Ethan dead at the scene. The county coroner listed cause of death as blunt force trauma due to a high-energy fall, with severe head trauma and fatal spinal injuries. Ethan's funeral drew attendees that included classmates who were with him at the park. The park permanently installed 12-foot fencing and increased security patrols. A subsequent investigation determined the ride had been functioning normally, and that the death resulted from unauthorized access to restricted infrastructure. No mechanical faults were identified, and the case was closed as a fatal trespassing incident. It was August 17, 2013, at a regional theme park in the southwestern United States. The late summer evening brought heavy crowds as temperatures cooled, and nighttime attractions began operating at full capacity. Elevated above the park's main concourse, an electric monorail looped continuously along a narrow concrete guideway, transporting guests between parking areas and the park's interior sections. 21-year-old Jason Moss arrived at the park shortly before closing with 2 friends after deciding not to purchase admission tickets. The group had spent most of the evening nearby and believed they could enter the park grounds by bypassing the ticketed gates near the monorail station. Jason had recently dropped out of community college and was working irregular construction jobs. Friends described him as impulsive and confident, often dismissing warnings as exaggerations. As the park began its closing procedures, the group moved toward a fenced maintenance corridor that ran parallel to the monorail's elevated track. Security staff noticed them entering a restricted area and immediately began shouting for them to stop and leave the zone. Jason ignored the warnings and climbed over a low barrier separating the walkway from the monorail guideway. The monorail system operated on a single beam track with no pedestrian clearance. Power was supplied through electrified rails mounted along the beam, and the train's rubber-tired undercarriage wrapped tightly around the guideway during operation. Trains traveled at speeds up to 35 miles per hour and required several hundred feet to come to a complete stop once emergency braking was initiated. Jason stepped onto the narrow edge of the guideway and began moving forward, apparently believing he could cross the track before the next train arrived. Security personnel continued shouting, warning him that a train was approaching. Surveillance footage later showed the monorail rounding a curve less than 200 feet away, already committed to the section of track Jason had entered. The operator initiated emergency braking as soon as the obstruction was visible, but the distance was insufficient. The front of the train struck Jason from behind, knocking him off balance and pinning him against the concrete beam. He was dragged approximately 40 feet along the guideway before the train came to a controlled stop. Park emergency teams reached the scene within minutes. Jason was found beneath the front section of the monorail with catastrophic injuries to his torso and lower extremities. He was unresponsive and showed no signs of life. Paramedics pronounced him dead at the scene due to massive blunt force trauma and crush injuries. The monorail line was shut down immediately, and passengers aboard the train were evacuated safely using maintenance walkways. The park closed the affected section for the remainder of the night. The investigation determined that Jason had entered a clearly marked restricted area and ignored repeated verbal warnings from security personnel. Mechanical inspections found no faults with the monorail's braking system or visibility. Investigators concluded that the train operator followed proper emergency procedures, but could not stop in time due to the system's operating limits. The death was ruled accidental, caused by trespassing onto an active transit guideway. Following the incident, the park installed higher fencing along maintenance corridors and added additional warning signage near monorail infrastructure. No charges were filed against park staff or operators. It was March 11, 2014. The afternoon heat hung heavy over an amusement park in Jakarta, Indonesia, where the Ferris wheel turned slowly against a hazy sky. Arman Hadi, a 26-year-old retail inventory clerk, stood in line with his girlfriend Siska Wulan, waiting to board a gondola car that would lift them 80 feet above the crowded park. Arman worked at a department store distribution center, managing stock counts and warehouse logistics. Friends described him as easygoing but occasionally careless. Arman had been warned on previous rides, testing the rules but ignored the cautions. A Ferris wheel operates through a continuous rotation system where enclosed gondola cars hang from a central wheel structure via mounting brackets, with each car secured by primary and secondary door latches designed to withstand the stresses of motion and passenger weight. At significant heights, the gondola doors opened outward, placing additional stress on the latch whenever riders leaned or pushed against the panel. Arman had ridden this Ferris wheel 3 times before, and was familiar with how the gondolas swayed during the rotation cycle, especially near the top. That afternoon, he joked about the rocking motion, climbing onto the seat and deliberately leaning his full body weight against the outward opening door to make the car swing more dramatically. Siska asked him to stop multiple times, but Arman laughed it off, pressing his back firmly against the door panel. The park's maintenance records would later reveal the gondola's primary latch had suffered significant wear, consistent with heavy daily operation over 8 months, reducing its holding strength. A visual inspection missed the fatigue, and corrosion pitting was noted later during fracture analysis. 3 weeks earlier, during routine servicing, a maintenance worker had incorrectly reinstalled the secondary safety latch, leaving it misaligned by 6 millimeters. The misalignment had been recorded in the inspection log with a cursory signature, unnoticed by the supervisor. Neither issue had been flagged during inspections. As their car reached approximately 80 feet, the highest point of the rotation, Arman leaned back against the door again. He shifted his weight aggressively, trying to increase the rocking motion. The worn primary latch, already stressed by the swaying movement, began to separate from its housing. The improperly installed secondary latch offered no backup support. At 3:47 in the afternoon, the door released completely. Arman, still pressing his full weight against it, fell backward through the opening. He dropped 80 feet in roughly 2.2 seconds, accelerating rapidly during the fall before striking the ground. The impact killed him instantly. Siska, standing near the door, reflexively lunged forward as he fell. She partially tumbled through the opening, but managed to grab the gondola's floor edge with both hands. Her legs dangled in open air as she screamed continuously. Passengers in adjacent cars witnessed everything and began shouting for help. The ride operator, hearing the screams from a distant control booth, hit the emergency stop within 8 seconds, then engaged the manual override to slowly rotate the wheel so Siska could safely reach the ground. Park rescue personnel reached Siska 6 minutes later, followed by municipal paramedics 4 minutes later. Arman's body lay motionless on the concrete below, his skull fractured and chest cavity crushed from the high-impact collision with the steel frame. The medical examiner confirmed the injuries were instantly fatal due to massive internal trauma and catastrophic brain injury. The amusement park suspended Ferris wheel operations indefinitely. Local regulators mandated an independent mechanical inspection before reopening. Arman's funeral drew over 50 mourners from his neighborhood and workplace. It was May 21st, 2017. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the amusement park in Staffordshire, England, where laughter and screams of joy echoed through the air. For Gareth Tyndall, a 42-year-old IT consultant from Birmingham, this was meant to be a celebration, his daughter's 10th birthday. Gareth wasn't someone who chased thrills. His colleagues at a regional tech firm described him as the type who read instruction manuals cover to cover and maintained spreadsheets for household expenses. He'd spent 15 years building database systems, approaching every task with precision and caution. His weekends were usually quiet, gardening, family dinners, helping with homework. But his daughter, Mara, had begged for something exciting this year, something different from the usual bowling parties and cinema trips. Gareth agreed to take her to the park's newest attraction. The 210-foot drop tower offered a skydiving-like free fall. Riders ascended slowly in seated carriages before dropping at speeds up to 60 miles per hour, slowed in the last 40 feet by magnetic brakes. That morning, maintenance staff completed their standard inspection. Minor corrosion was noted on several secondary seatbelt buckles, but technicians marked them acceptable since the primary restraints passed testing. The secondary belts had not undergone individual load testing for 3 months due to internal policies that prioritized monthly checks of the primary system. By 2:15 in the afternoon, 17 riders were strapped into their seats, including Gareth and Mara, positioned side by side in row 3. The ride operator moved down each row, tugging harnesses and checking buckles visually. Everything clicked properly. Unbeknownst to the operator, the secondary safety belt on Gareth's seat had been weakened by corrosion that was not detected during inspection, leaving the webbing vulnerable under the intense forces of the drop. Gareth likely felt the over-shoulder restraint press against his chest and shoulders. The carriage began its slow mechanical ascent, gears grinding steadily as the ground receded below. At 210 feet, the carriage paused for 3 seconds. Then the release mechanism activated. The drop was supposed to be smooth, controlled by magnetic brakes engaging progressively. But halfway through the descent, as the braking phase began at approximately 80 feet from ground, Gareth's left shoulder secondary seatbelt snapped clean through. The corroded buckle, weakened by months of moisture exposure and metal pitting, gave way under the intense deceleration forces generated during the braking phase of the drop. His upper body lifted violently from the seat. The primary over-shoulder hydraulic harness held his torso at the chest, but his left arm and shoulder pivoted upward and forward at unnatural speed due to the partial restraint failure. Gareth's left shoulder and ribcage collided with the steel restraint frame. His head snapped sideways, striking the metal housing. The ride continued its programmed braking sequence for 7 more seconds. The ride's control system only verified that the primary restraints were locked before the ride cycle began, so the system continued the drop and braking sequence despite the secondary belt failure. Gareth's body jerked repeatedly against the intact right side restraint. Mara and other riders screamed as the carriage finally reached ground level and locked into position. The operator hit the emergency alarm. Park security arrived within 90 seconds, followed by paramedics minutes later. Gareth showed no pulse. The coroner's report stated death resulted from massive blunt force trauma, including 8 fractured ribs, ruptured spleen and liver, and severe cranial fractures causing immediate brain hemorrhage. The park closed immediately pending investigation. Engineers discovered 14 corroded secondary restraints across 3 rides, all manufactured by the same fictional supplier. The ride remained closed for 11 months during retrofitting. Gareth's funeral was attended by friends, family, and co-workers. Mara required years of counseling after witnessing the incident from inches away. The park later settled with the family, and the operator left the industry. It was October 15, 2017, at a fall festival in rural Indiana. The evening midway buzzed with flashing lights, music, and the mechanical hum of carnival rides spinning above the crowd. Near the center of the grounds stood a large rotor ride, a circular chamber designed to spin riders against its padded walls using centrifugal force. John Stevenson was a 19-year-old high school basketball captain, known among his friends for his confidence and competitive streak. On the court, he thrived on challenges, often pushing himself harder whenever someone doubted what he could do. That same attitude carried into everyday situations, especially when he was surrounded by friends who expected him to live up to that fearless reputation. Earlier that evening, John and 3 teammates were heading home from basketball practice when they noticed the festival lights along the roadside and decided to stop for a while. After walking the midway and sharing a few beers, their attention turned to a large rotor ride where riders stood against the wall of a spinning chamber, held in place by centrifugal force. Watching a cycle finish, one of John's friends joked that it looked easy and suggested a small bet. Anyone who could move away from the wall and reach the center while it was spinning would win the money. John immediately laughed and claimed he could do it without much trouble. To him, the ride seemed more like a simple balance challenge than anything dangerous. The group agreed on the bet, and a few minutes later they stepped inside the chamber with the next group of riders. When the ride began, the chamber slowly started to rotate. At first, the movement felt gentle as riders leaned back against the wall, but as the motor accelerated and the ride reached full speed, the floor beneath the riders dropped away, leaving everyone pinned tightly against the padded wall by the spinning force. John grinned as he felt the force holding him in place. Around him, riders lifted their feet slightly, allowing the force of the spinning chamber to keep them pinned against the wall. The bet was still fresh in his mind, and his friends were already shouting across the chamber, reminding him about the challenge. Instead of staying still like the others, John pressed his shoes firmly against the wall and began pushing his body forward, trying to move toward the center of the chamber. At first, he managed to shift slightly, leaning away from the wall while the ride continued spinning at full speed. The moment he pushed far enough away from the wall, he lost the surface that had been holding him in place. Without that stabilizing pressure, his balance collapsed instantly. His feet slipped as he lost his grip against the wall, and the spinning motion flung his body sideways across the rotating chamber. Before he could recover, the force hurled him violently back toward the outer wall. His head struck the rigid structure with severe force as the ride continued spinning for several seconds before operators realized something was wrong. Other riders began shouting and signaling for help as the chamber finally slowed to a stop. Emergency responders were called immediately, but John was pronounced dead at the scene from severe head trauma after striking the outer wall of the spinning chamber. The rotor ride was temporarily shut down while operators assisted investigators and inspected the equipment. Authorities later confirmed the ride had been functioning normally and that the fatal injuries occurred after John attempted to move away from the wall of the spinning chamber during a bet with friends. It was June 18, 2015, when 17-year-old Grayson Miller finished his shift at a local retail store and met up with 3 friends at a nearby amusement park in northern Ohio for an evening of rides. Grayson was known for his infectious enthusiasm and willingness to try anything once. The recent rain had just cleared, leaving the boardwalk glistening under the early evening lights. His companions included his cousin Tyler, a 19-year-old warehouse worker whose quiet demeanor balanced Grayson's outgoing personality, May, an 18-year-old lifeguard whose attentive nature came from watching over swimmers, and Jordan, a 17-year-old cashier whose upbeat attitude matched Grayson's energy. The group decided to start with the classic chair swing ride as a low-intensity warm-up. The vintage ride featured suspended chairs hanging from chains, with riders lifted outward by centrifugal force as the central hub rotated. They noticed one chair in the inner ring had been roped off, but the outer ring operated at full capacity. A maintenance notice indicated chain inspection had been completed the previous day. The operator announced a slightly longer cycle, and music volume was turned up high enough to mask mechanical sounds. Grayson and Jordan shared a dual seat swing in the outer ring. The seating included a lap chain and a simple secondary seatbelt. The attendant performed a standard tug check before moving to the next chair. What none could detect was a microscopic crack in a chain link near the seat's clevis connection. This fatigue failure develops gradually over thousands of loading cycles, remaining invisible until catastrophic failure. As rotation began, chairs lifted outward in the familiar pattern. Speed increased toward maximum, and wind from the nearby lake pushed outer chairs to dramatic angles. The cyclical loading placed repetitive stress on every suspension component. The hidden crack propagated rapidly under cyclical stress, until reaching critical size. The right side support chain failed suddenly, causing the dual seat to twist violently as the left side chain momentarily took full load of both riders. The asymmetric loading proved too much for the remaining connection. The left side S-hook, a legacy connector from the ride's original construction, deformed under extreme force and tore free from its attachment point. Both Grayson and Jordan separated simultaneously, but their trajectories diverged based on instantaneous swing position. Jordan's path carried him clear of the perimeter fence, resulting in serious but survivable injuries on grass beyond the ride area. Grayson's trajectory intersected with a decorative light pole lining the midway. The impact occurred chest first at significant velocity, followed by contact with concrete pavement below. The operator immediately engaged the emergency stop, but the rotating structure required time to decelerate safely. May quickly assisted Jordan, applying first aid while directing emergency responders to both victims. Tyler called emergency services and guided paramedics through the gathering crowd. Emergency medical services arrived within minutes and began triage. Jordan was stabilized and transported with multiple fractures but intact vital signs. Grayson had sustained fatal chest trauma, including multiple rib fractures, cardiac and pulmonary injuries, catastrophic internal bleeding, and secondary traumatic brain injury. Advanced life support protocols were initiated, but injury severity prevented circulation restoration. Grayson was pronounced dead at the scene despite the emergency team's efforts. The investigation focused on failed chain components and S-hook connector age. Metallurgical examination revealed classic fatigue failure signs, while the deformed S-hook showed gradual weakening over time. The ride was secured, and similar attractions were suspended pending comprehensive inspection. The ride dated back to the late 1980s and was still operating under older inspection standards. It was October 31st, 2018. The narrow cobblestone streets of Krakow's Old Town buzzed with Halloween festivities as temporary haunted attractions sprouted in converted warehouses throughout the historic district. Marek Zielinski, a 29-year-old personal trainer from a local fitness chain, stood outside a temporary haunted attraction with his date, Anna, dismissing the screams echoing from within as theatrical nonsense designed to fool tourists and children. Marek had built his reputation on physical toughness and mental resilience. Working at a popular gym franchise, he specialized in high-intensity training and martial arts conditioning, often incorporating kickboxing techniques into client workouts. His social media featured videos of him breaking boards and performing advanced kicks. That evening, he'd spent 20 minutes outside the attraction loudly explaining to his date how haunted houses use cheap psychology and fake scares. Haunted attractions rely on controlled environments where actors and animatronics create startling effects through timing, lighting, and sound. Most temporary installations use lightweight construction materials like plywood partitions and fabric walls to create maze-like corridors quickly and cheaply. Behind these thin barriers, mechanical systems operate pulleys, pneumatic devices, and moving figures designed to surprise visitors at predetermined moments. Safety protocols typically require reinforced barriers between public areas and mechanical spaces, but temporary attractions operating under short-term permits often rely on minimal separation to save time and cost. According to Anna, Marek had convinced her to visit the temporary haunted attraction. The attraction featured a series of narrow corridors lined with jump scares, including motion-activated animatronics designed to lunge at visitors. Marek entered the maze likely determined to prove his point, challenging the actors to try scaring him. When other visitors screamed at planned scares, he laughed dismissively. His aggressive behavior was drawing complaints from other customers trying to enjoy the experience, though no staff intervened before the incident. The incident occurred in the attraction's third corridor, where a mechanical zombie was programmed to burst through a false wall when motion sensors detected approaching visitors. As the animatronic activated, Marek decided to demonstrate his martial arts skills by attempting a high roundhouse kick aimed at the figure's head. The kick connected of the animatronic, but his follow-through carried his leg beyond the target. His right foot punched through the thin plywood barrier, separating the public corridor from the mechanical service area behind the walls. The partition, constructed from approximately half-inch plywood intended only as a visual divider, offered no resistance to his frame moving at full force. As his leg broke through, a continuously cycling steel cable loop driven by a small industrial motor with no load-sensing cutoff caught his ankle, snagging and tightening. The motor continued running, as programmed to complete its movement cycle unless manually shut down. Marek's body was pulled violently against the jagged opening he'd created. His upper spine struck the sharp plywood edge with devastating force as the cable system dragged him partially into the cramped mechanical space. The impact fractured his cervical spine, causing immediate paralysis, and loss of voluntary breathing, while his lower back was crushed against the metal framework supporting the animatronic systems. His scream cut off abruptly as spinal shock and respiratory failure set in, and witnesses heard the mechanical grinding continue for several seconds before staff realized something had gone wrong. Anna immediately called emergency services while attraction employees shut down power to the mechanical systems. Paramedics arrived fast, but required additional time to carefully extract Marek's body from the tangled machinery. He was pronounced dead at the scene after sustained respiratory arrest and catastrophic spinal trauma. The medical examiner determined that high cervical spinal cord injury leading to respiratory failure was the primary cause of death, with severe blunt force injuries to the torso contributing. The temporary haunted attraction was permanently closed and dismantled within 48 hours. City officials launched investigations into temporary attraction safety standards, leading to stricter construction requirements for seasonal entertainment venues. It was October 6, 2016, at a regional fairground, where crowds moved beneath glowing midway lights as a Ferris wheel turned steadily above damp pavement on an overcast evening. Evan Brooks was 27 and had recently begun trying to build a small online following through short vlogs and stunt clips. He worked full-time as a delivery driver out of Tacoma, spending long days on the road and filming whenever he had time off. His videos were simple: rides, heights, risky angles meant to look fearless. Friends said he liked showing he was calm in situations that made others nervous, especially when there was a camera involved. That evening, Evan arrived alone after finishing his route early. Weather reports earlier in the day had mentioned scattered thunderstorms moving toward Pierce County, but the fair remained open. The air was warm and heavy, clouds gathering low over the grounds. Evan bought multiple tickets for the Ferris wheel, telling friends later online that he wanted storm footage from above the fair. Warning lights near the ride signaled that weather could cause delays, and recorded announcements repeated that the wheel might stop without notice. Evan boarded anyway, phone already recording. The gondola rose slowly as wind pushed lightly against the cabin. Below him, the midway lights blurred into long streaks across the wet pavement. As the wheel climbed higher, thunder rolled somewhere beyond the fairgrounds. Evan continued filming, leaning toward the open side window to keep the clouds in frame. Other riders later said he appeared focused on his phone, adjusting angles instead of watching the ride. Near the top of the rotation, the wheel slowed as operators prepared for a possible shutdown. Wind gusts rocked the gondola gently. The metal frame creaked overhead. Evan shifted forward again, stretching his arm out to capture the darkening sky. A sudden flash lit the clouds nearby. The thunder followed almost immediately. Witnesses said Evan flinched at the sound. In the same moment, the gondola swayed sharply in the wind. Still leaning forward with one hand braced against the window frame, Evan lost his balance. His upper body tipped past the open side. Security footage later showed him trying to pull back, his phone slipping from his hand as his weight shifted outward. With only a low metal lap bar across the opening, his torso slid over it and through the gap. In less than a second, his hips cleared the seat edge, and he fell from the gondola. Operators stopped the wheel immediately and called emergency services at 8:17 p.m. Fair staff cleared the area as responders arrived within minutes. Evan was found on the ground beneath the Ferris wheel, unresponsive and bleeding heavily from head and chest injuries. Paramedics attempted resuscitation, but no pulse or breathing was detected. He was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner later ruled the cause of death multiple blunt force injuries from a fall from height. Fractures to the skull, spine, and internal organs indicated death occurred instantly on impact. Investigators found no mechanical failure with the gondola, and confirmed weather conditions had not yet reached shutdown thresholds when Evan boarded. Witness statements and video showed he had been leaning out of the open side while filming when he lost his balance. The Ferris wheel closed for the night as storms moved in. Evan's phone was recovered near the base of the ride, its final recording ending in blurred lights and wind noise just before the fall. It was October 12, 2013. One of Tokyo City's amusement park hummed with its usual Saturday afternoon energy, roller coasters cycling through their loops while families moved between attractions. In a restricted maintenance corridor behind a roller coaster, 25-year-old Kaito Nakamura was about to make the last questionable decision of his life. Kaito was a third-year business student at a private university in Shibuya, known among classmates for increasingly reckless stunts. They accompanied him trespassing in construction sites, climbing transmission towers, and sneaking into off-limits areas. Friends described him as desperate for attention, someone who constantly needed to one-up his previous stunts. He had received multiple warnings from university administrators about his activities. That specific roller coaster in Tokyo had a maintenance zone that housed heavy cart transport systems that moved along floor-mounted rails, shuttling ride vehicles between the main track and service bays. The service carts weighed approximately 800 pounds empty and carried 600-pound ride vehicles, totaling roughly 1,400 pounds when loaded. Floors were normally clean and dry, but a recent maintenance task left a slick patch of hydraulic fluid near the rails. Multiple signs in Japanese warned unauthorized personnel about crush hazards and moving equipment, with access restricted by locked gates, keypad-controlled doors, and motion sensors. That afternoon, Kaito arrived at the park with 3 friends who knew about his plan to infiltrate the maintenance area. His friends said that he planned to climb the service fence, photograph himself beside the actual ride mechanisms, and escape. His friends protested weakly, pointing out the danger signs, but Kaito dismissed their concerns as cowardice. He had successfully trespassed in dozens of locations without incident, likely building a false confidence. At 2:47 in the afternoon, an exterior security camera captured Kaito scaling the chain-link barrier, while his friends watched nervously from outside. Internal cameras in the corridor recorded him as he landed. Although cameras covered the corridor, the live operator was focused on passenger loading and ride dispatch monitors rather than the maintenance transport feed. Carts moved every 4 minutes along the rails. Warning lights flashed amber throughout the corridor, indicating the system was operational. The automated cart system was live because a maintenance crew was working on a different section of the track, requiring transport carts to remain active to shuttle vehicles between service bays. Full lockout-tagout procedures had not been applied to the transport corridor. Kaito seemed to have ignored everything, likely focusing on getting the perfect shot. Moving deeper into the restricted space, Kaito positioned himself near the rail system for a photograph. The concrete floor was coated with a thin layer of hydraulic oil left from a recent repair. As he turned to signal his friends, his feet slid out from under him. He fell directly into the path of an incoming transport cart carrying a fully loaded 1,400-pound coaster vehicle, moving at approximately 8 miles per hour. Emergency brakes engaged immediately but could not stop the cart in time. The crushing impact was instantaneous. Kaito's body was compressed between the cart and a concrete support pillar, causing catastrophic blunt force trauma to his chest and abdomen. The impact left extensive blood evidence across the cart and surrounding structure. His friends screamed, and one immediately called emergency services. Park medics reached the corridor within 4 minutes but could not provide life-saving intervention. First responders arrived within 7 minutes. The coroner determined death occurred within seconds from catastrophic blunt force trauma to the thorax, resulting in multiple rib fractures, collapsed lungs, and severe heart damage. Toxicology tests were negative. Surveillance footage from the exterior and corridor cameras confirmed the entire sequence from illegal entry to fatal impact. Park management handed all footage to authorities. They interviewed his 3 friends regarding the incident and noted their delayed call to security. The friends required psychological counseling for months, haunted by watching their peer die for their validation in a completely preventable tragedy. It was June 22nd, 2013. On a historic amusement pier along the Atlantic City coastline, the overcast afternoon followed heavy morning thunderstorms that had soaked the wooden decking and left standing water throughout covered areas of the park. By early afternoon, Operators reopened most attractions as weather conditions improved, and families began returning to the pier to enjoy the weekend. 42-year-old David Park arrived with his 15-year-old son, Kevin, hoping to spend uninterrupted time together after several difficult months following his divorce. David worked as a licensed electrician and was accustomed to noticing hazards most people overlooked. As they walked the pier, he observed water pooled near extension cords, older electrical cabinets, and arcade machines housed in structures that offered little protection from wind-driven rain. He chose not to comment, wanting the day to feel normal for Kevin. The two drifted toward the pier's enclosed arcade, one of the few attractions still busy while outdoor rides dried out. Rows of vintage machines lined the narrow interior, their power supplied through floor-level junction boxes installed decades earlier. The wooden floor remained damp from water tracked in by visitors escaping the rain. David and Kevin paused near a row of classic racing cabinets. Kevin began playing while David stood nearby, leaning against a support beam and watching. As David shifted his footing, his shoe slid slightly on the wet surface. He instinctively reached out and grabbed the metal side panel of an arcade cabinet to steady himself. The cabinet's internal wiring had been compromised earlier that morning when rainwater seeped into its electrical housing. The fault allowed current to energize the cabinet's metal casing. When David made contact, he received a sudden electrical shock that caused his muscles to contract involuntarily. He lost balance and fell backward, striking the back of his head against the hardwood floor. Nearby patrons heard the impact and called for help as Kevin rushed to his father's side. Arcade staff immediately cut power to the affected row of machines and contacted emergency services. David was unconscious and breathing irregularly when first responders arrived minutes later. Paramedics stabilized him and transported him to a nearby medical center. Imaging revealed a severe traumatic brain injury caused by blunt force impact during the fall. Despite intensive care efforts, including measures to control swelling and intracranial pressure, David never regained consciousness. He was pronounced dead later that evening due to complications from head trauma. The investigation determined that the electrical shock was non-lethal, but directly contributed to the fall that caused the fatal injury. Inspectors found that multiple arcade machines were inadequately sealed against moisture, and that floor-level electrical connections were not properly protected for wet conditions common on the pier. The affected arcade was shut down temporarily while damaged equipment and wiring were replaced. Pier management implemented updated procedures requiring immediate closure of indoor attractions following heavy rain until electrical systems could be inspected and dry conditions confirmed. No criminal charges were filed, and the incident was ruled an accidental death resulting from environmental conditions and aging infrastructure. It was January 21st, 2018. The morning sun beat down on a water park on Australia's Gold Coast, where families lined up for slides and wave pools under cloudless skies. Martin Vale stood in line for the park's fastest water slide with 3 friends from his old club. Martin, 50, had spent 15 years playing semi-professional rugby for a coastal league team before retiring at 38 due to recurring knee injuries. His teammates remembered him as physically imposing and stubborn, someone who refused to tap out during training no matter how exhausted. Water slides operate on simple physics. Gravity accelerates riders down angled chutes, while water reduces friction, with speed controlled by slide angle and rider position. Park regulations required all riders to go feet first to prevent head and neck injuries, with multiple signs posted at every slide entrance. The 200-foot slide Martin was queuing for reached speeds of approximately 38 miles per hour, ending in a shallow run-out trough designed to slow riders before they reached the catch pool. That afternoon, Martin and his friends had been drinking beer since noon at the poolside bar. By 2:15 in the afternoon, they reached the slide platform. Martin loudly announced to his group that he would go head first like he had done at smaller slides earlier that day, ignoring the prominent feet first only signs posted at eye level. The teenage attendant attempted to stop Martin, but he ignored the instruction entirely, stepping into the lane before the attendant could intervene further. Platform CCTV later showed Martin move into the lane, and ride sensor logs confirmed a momentary fault in the dispatch interlock that day. Martin positioned himself head first at the slide entrance, arms extended forward like a swimmer. Without waiting for the attendant's clearance signal, He pushed off forcefully, launching himself into the enclosed tube. His friends later told investigators they assumed the attendant had approved the launch. Martin accelerated rapidly down the steep sections, water pressure forcing his head lower as he picked up speed. Entering the run-out trough at approximately 38 miles per hour, his streamlined position prevented the natural slowdown that other riders experienced. His low head position caused his forehead to strike the fiberglass floor of the trough during deceleration, forcing his neck into a sudden forward compression. The impact stopped his forward head momentum, but his 220-pound body continued sliding forward, driving his face along the trough bottom for another 15 feet. Witnesses in the catch pool area saw Martin's body slide face down into the shallow water, arms floating limply at his sides. He made no attempt to lift his head or roll over. Water entered his mouth and nose as he floated motionless in 3 feet of water. The lifeguard reached him within 20 seconds, held his head and neck rigid while rolling him supine onto a rescue board, began rescue breathing and chest compressions, and had a defibrillator on scene within a minute. Martin showed no voluntary respiratory effort. He showed no visible response as rescuers continued emergency care. The lifeguard radioed for emergency services while continuing rescue protocols. He was transported to a regional hospital, where imaging revealed catastrophic brainstem injury from the initial impact and secondary hypoxic brain damage from water aspiration and oxygen deprivation. Martin remained on life support for 14 days, while physicians conducted multiple neurological assessments. All tests showed complete absence of brain activity. His family authorized withdrawal of mechanical ventilation on February 4, 2018. The coroner listed cause of death as severe hypoxic brain injury, secondary to blunt force head trauma and drowning. The water park temporarily closed the slide for investigation. Investigators reviewed CCTV footage, sensor logs, and bar service records. Ride attendants underwent mandatory retraining, emphasizing strict enforcement of dispatch procedures, rider positioning rules, and alcohol policies. It was October 8, 2013. The neon-lit halls of a popular indoor amusement park in Seoul hummed with laughter and screams, masking the tragedy about to unfold on a roller coaster designed for thrills, not for someone whose brain couldn't handle flashing lights. Minji Choi, a 21-year-old economics student, had been managing her epilepsy since age 14 with medication and trigger avoidance. She and her parents knew bright strobing lights could induce seizures, but they said that she'd been seizure-free for 8 months and desperately wanted to feel normal around her classmates. When 5 friends from her study group suggested the amusement park, they said she agreed without hesitation, likely not wanting to be left behind again. That afternoon, Minji stood in line for the park's signature indoor coaster with her classmates. According to her friend Sujin Park, Minji had mentioned the posted warning signs about seizure disorders, but dismissed them, saying she'd been fine for months and didn't want to sit out alone. The signs were large, bold, and bilingual, reading "Do not ride if you have a history of epilepsy, seizures, fainting, or are sensitive to flashing lights." The ride's high-speed turns through enclosed tunnels had strobe lights flashing at 15 to 20 times per second, a frequency that can trigger photosensitive seizures in susceptible riders. Operators conducted standard restraint checks as riders boarded the 6-car train. Minji secured herself into the 4th row, pulling down the over-the-shoulder harness that clicked into place with mechanical certainty. Cameras covered the station and approach areas, but the enclosed tunnel sections were too dark and fast for operators to clearly monitor individual riders during the ride cycle. The lighting system activated as the train lurched forward into darkness, accelerating to 45 miles per hour within seconds. Approximately 18 seconds into the ride, the train entered the main strobe tunnel. The lights pulsed rapidly in alternating red and white patterns, designed for maximum visual impact. Minji's body went rigid almost immediately. Sujin, seated directly beside her, noticed her friend's hands lock onto the restraint bar, knuckles white, before violent convulsions began. Minji began tongue-biting and foaming slightly at the mouth. Consistent with a generalized tonic-clonic seizure, Minji's head snapped backward, then whipped forward with brutal force into the padded shoulder restraint. Her body seized uncontrollably, muscles contracting so violently that her spine arched against the seat. Each pulse of the strobe light seemed to intensify the convulsions. Her head struck the metal frame beneath the padding repeatedly. Her legs kicked spasmodically against the footrest. Sujin's screams for help were drowned out by the ride's audio system. The seizure continued through 2 more tunnel sections, roughly 25 seconds of violent, uncontrolled movement. When the train pulled into the station, operators immediately noticed Minji slumped motionless in her harness, blood visible on the gray padding where her head had repeatedly struck the restraint during the seizure. Park medics attempted airway management and CPR. Paramedics arrived within 7 minutes and found no pulse. Investigators later determined that the violent seizure, combined with the ride's forces, caused repeated impacts against the restraint that resulted in fatal head trauma. Ride telemetry, grainy station CCTV, and the car's forward-facing camera captured only a blurred outline and flailing movements, confirming the sequence of events. The medical examiner ruled the death a traumatic brain injury sustained during a seizure on the ride. The park reinforced warning signage and implemented mandatory health questionnaires checked by staff before boarding. Local media coverage remained minimal, a brief safety advisory buried in metropolitan news sections. Minji's classmates placed flowers at the coaster entrance 3 days later, a quiet memorial to a friend who wanted nothing more than to fit in. It was May 27, 2015, at a county fair amusement park in Oklahoma. Dark storm clouds gathered on the western horizon as families moved along the busy midway. The air felt heavy with humidity while distant thunder rumbled, but rides were still operating as visitors rushed to enjoy the attractions while the storm approached from several miles away. Kestra Dwin, a 17-year-old high school junior and track team member, had come to the fair with 3 classmates after their school meet earlier that afternoon. Friends later said Kestra loved heights and rarely turned down a ride that climbed above the fairgrounds. As thunder echoed closer, she joked that filming lightning from the top of the Ferris wheel would make an incredible video, brushing off her friends' warnings and the ride operator's announcement, telling riders to remain seated and keep their hands inside the gondola. The 120-foot Ferris wheel stood as the fair's centerpiece, its steel frame painted in bright red and white stripes. Open metal gondolas swayed slightly in the strengthening wind as operators continued loading passengers while the sky darkened. Kestra and one friend climbed into an open gondola and sat on the metal bench as the wheel began its slow rotation. The gondola had simple side rails but no overhead protection. As they rose higher, wind gusts rocked the gondola more noticeably, causing the suspended car to sway gently back and forth. When their gondola reached roughly 100 feet above the ground, the wheel paused to load passengers below. Instead of staying seated, Kestra stood up inside the gondola and leaned over the rail to film the lightning forming in the distance. To steady herself against the wind, she gripped 2 separate metal bars of the gondola frame with both hands while holding her phone out over the side. Lightning flickered in the approaching storm as the cell moved closer to the fairgrounds. Several people on the midway glanced nervously toward the darkening sky, while others continued riding, assuming the storm was still some distance away. A lightning strike hit near the upper steel frame of the Ferris wheel, sending electrical current through parts of the structure. The electrical current spread through the spokes and support structure, traveling downward along the ride's metal framework toward the ground. As the charge passed through the gondola mounting arm, a brief side flash arced between the energized bracket and the nearby rail that Kestra was gripping while standing over the side of the gondola recording the storm. Witnesses below saw a bright flash and sparks near the gondola bracket. The discharge passed across her hands and through her upper body for a split second before continuing into the ride's grounded frame. Kestra immediately collapsed sideways onto the bench. Small electrical burns marked her palms where the arc had contacted the metal rail. Her friend, who had remained seated away from the rails, was unharmed and began calling for help from their elevated position while signaling toward the operators below. Fairgoers on the ground alerted ride operators, who began manually rotating the wheel to bring the gondola down. The process took several minutes as each gondola had to be lowered in sequence, while the storm continued approaching and distant thunder grew louder. Emergency responders were waiting when the gondola finally reached ground level. They determined that the lightning discharge triggered a cardiac arrhythmia that caused Kestra to collapse after the current passed through her upper body during the strike. Witnesses later confirmed that Kestra had ignored instructions to remain seated and had stood up while gripping the exposed metal frame of the gondola to film the lightning storm from the top of the ride, a decision that placed her directly in the path of the electrical side flash. It was July 2nd, 2017, when 34-year-old Ethan Ward arrived at a local amusement park in Allentown, Pennsylvania, with two colleagues for what was supposed to be a refreshing break from the sweltering summer heat. Ethan worked in an office environment and was known for his methodical approach to everything. His colleagues had convinced him to join them for a midday outing to beat the oppressive temperatures. Accompanying Ethan were Priya, a 29-year-old administrative worker whose attention to detail made her invaluable at work, and Luis, a 36-year-old delivery driver whose upbeat personality could lift anyone's spirits. The trio decided that the park's classic log flume would be perfect to cool off while enjoying some mild thrills. As they approached the attraction, they noticed a sign indicating reduced capacity due to maintenance on one water pump. The water level appeared marginally lower than usual, but operations continued. A boat ahead had briefly stalled before the conveyor lift, then resumed after a few moments. This log flume operated without lap bars, following traditional design where riders sat in line with feet in a front footwell separated by a central divider. Ethan took the front position, with Priya behind him and Luis in the rear. The operator reminded them to keep arms inside and maintain proper seating position. As their log engaged the conveyor lift, they heard a slight shudder during the first small drop. An audible scraping sound began from the right side, and the hull rode higher against the right channel fender than normal. Overhead speakers crackled intermittently, though a maintenance technician had given an all-clear gesture. At the second drop entry, the boat's trajectory became problematic. The bow climbed onto the side panel and caught on a protruding bolt head. The log yawed and became wedged diagonally across the waterway. Oncoming water pushed the bow downward while the stern remained elevated. Ethan's shins slid under the central divider, and his feet became trapped in the front footwell's geometry. The jam angle and water pressure made withdrawal impossible. Priya tried pulling him backward, while Luis helped from behind, but without proper leverage, their efforts proved futile. The boat remained locked diagonally across the channel. The pump system continued operating, forcing water into a confined pocket around the bow. Within minutes, the front compartment filled rapidly, and water rose toward Ethan's chin as he remained trapped forward. Attendants quickly signaled to shut down pumps, but mechanical access to free the jammed hull took precious time. Water flow couldn't be stopped immediately because the pump isolation valves were located in a locked service alcove. The hand attempt to lift the boat failed due to torque from the wedged position and accumulated water weight. As the surging water continued overtopping the bow section, Ethan's airway became repeatedly submerged, despite frantic efforts from companions and the arriving maintenance crew. Extraction remained blocked until they brought mechanical prying tools. By the time maintenance used a pry bar to free the boat's bow from the protruding bolt, Ethan had sustained fatal injuries from prolonged submersion and entrapment. Emergency medical services performed CPR and advanced airway management, but were unable to restore a sustainable pulse. The investigation revealed that the protruding bolt and excessive guide wheel wear had created conditions for the hull to jam. Reduced water flow from the offline pump also contributed to the boat's abnormal positioning. Priya's detailed account of the scraping sounds provided crucial information for investigators, while Luis confirmed the jam sequence. The affected channel section was immediately drained and closed, pending a complete safety review of all hardware and water flow systems. It was June 3, 2017. The afternoon sun beat down on the outdoor karting facility in Leipzig, casting long shadows across the asphalt track. Thomas Richter, a 41-year-old warehouse supervisor, adjusted his helmet one final time before climbing into cart number 14. Thomas wasn't a racer. He worked the night shift at a logistics company outside Leipzig, managing inventory and supervising a small crew. Co-workers described him as competent but volatile, prone to explosive outbursts when things didn't go his way. He'd been written up twice in the past year for confronting employees who made mistakes, and his supervisor had placed him on formal probation just 3 weeks earlier. Go-karting involves piloting small, low-powered vehicles around tight circuits at speeds up to approximately 35 to 40 miles per hour, where drivers sit inches from the ground in minimal safety equipment, relying primarily on full-face helmets and rigid seat positioning in a sport where light contact between carts is common and expected. The low-slung rental cart lacked a roll bar or seatbelt, relying entirely on the driver remaining seated for stability. Tomas hadn't been on a kart track in over a decade, but his brother had organized the outing for his birthday. The facility required all drivers to attend a brief safety orientation, covering basic rules: keep both hands on the wheel, remain seated at all times, and never attempt to turn around or remove hands from the steering wheel during a session. Others noted that Tomas seemed distracted during the briefing, checking his phone. The recreational race began normally with 12 drivers navigating the roughly quarter-mile circuit. Tomas started in 8th position, immediately showing his inexperience by taking corners too aggressively and falling behind slower, more cautious drivers. His frustration was visible even through his helmet, as recreational drivers passed him on the inside lines. Track cameras captured him gesturing angrily at other drivers and shouting inside his helmet. On lap 7, another driver made light contact with Thomas's rear bumper while attempting to pass on the inside of turn 3. The bump was minor, but Thomas reacted explosively. Security footage shows him immediately turning around in his seat to shout at the driver behind him. In his rage, he lifted himself out of the seat, ignoring the track rule. While Thomas was turned backward in his seat, screaming and gesturing, his unmanned cart drifted toward the outside of turn 4 at approximately 20 to 25 miles per hour. Without his weight properly centered in the seat, lateral cornering forces caused his upper body to tip over the side of the cart, and he was ejected head first onto the asphalt track. His helmet struck the pavement with devastating force. His driverless cart immediately struck his prone body, followed seconds later by another cart whose driver couldn't avoid the sudden obstruction. Track marshals stopped the race instantly and called emergency services. Paramedics arrived within 8 minutes. He was transported by advanced life support ambulance to the hospital, where he died 4 hours later from massive brain injuries. The medical examiner determined death resulted from severe skull fractures and traumatic brain injury consistent with high-energy impact, with the track surface followed by secondary cart contact. The facility immediately implemented stricter martial authority to black flag aggressive behavior and enhanced pre-race briefings, emphasizing zero tolerance for confrontational conduct. Thomas's employer later revealed he'd been on probation for workplace anger incidents, raising questions about how unmanaged behavioral issues can translate into risk during high adrenaline recreational activities. It was August 3, 2016, at a water park in Phoenix, Arizona. By late morning, heat sat heavy over packed walkways. Temperatures passed 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Whistles sounded, pumps roared, and safety rules looped, blending into the background as families queued, restless, slick with sunscreen, waiting for slides to clear. Daniel Kress was 38 and worked as a shift supervisor at a warehouse in Glendale. He ran crews, filled in when people called out, and liked being known as dependable. After a doctor warned him about high blood pressure, he lost nearly 40 pounds. The physical change led him to take more physical risks without medical clearance. At home, Daniel was a hands-on dad to 2 young kids and had been married since his early 20s. He liked recording small moments on his phone. Nothing public, just clips sent to family chats. In the months before the incident, coworkers noticed he increasingly joked about still having it and proving he wasn't fragile. It was his day off. By noon, the heat was brutal and the park was packed, with lines spilling across hot concrete and lifeguards shouting to be heard. Daniel pointed to the tallest speed slide, a near vertical body slide built for maximum drop and acceleration. Signs and staff repeatedly warned riders to go feet first. Daniel laughed it off, strapped his phone into a waterproof chest pouch, and ignored another warning about head-first entries increasing speed and risk at the shallow runout. When it was his turn, Daniel didn't sit the way he was told. He leaned forward, tucked his arms in tight, and pushed off head first. A fixed overhead safety camera later confirmed his launch angle, and body position differed from the required posture. The slide's angle forced him to pick up speed almost immediately. Water slammed against his shoulders as the tube narrowed. When he burst out of the exit, his head was the first point of contact. His forehead struck the concrete lip at the end of the slide. His neck violently folded under the force, while the rest of his body continued forward due to momentum. His torso folded, then struck the water's surface flat. People nearby saw his body slide several feet and roll face down. He did not attempt to lift his head or arms. Riders exiting behind him collided with his lower body, rolling him face down in the shallow runout. Screaming started immediately. Lifeguards activated emergency protocols and entered the pool. Daniel was pulled onto the deck within seconds. His body was unresponsive, with no purposeful movement, and his eyes remained open but unfocused. His phone case was cracked across his chest. Lifeguards initiated emergency care while another staff member called 911. Security footage later documented the precise impact point at the slide exit. Paramedics arrived approximately 7 minutes after the call. They immobilized his neck, assessed breathing and pulse, and transferred him onto a stretcher as guests were cleared from the area. No spontaneous breathing or response was observed. He was pronounced dead shortly after arrival at the emergency department, per hospital protocol. The medical examiner determined that Daniel died from a high cervical spine fracture. The impact fractured vertebrae at the base of the skull, disrupting the spinal cord and brainstem, which immediately stopped breathing and heart regulation. The report stated survival was not possible given the injury severity. The death was ruled an accident caused by unsafe riding behavior. Toxicology tests showed no alcohol or drugs. Investigators noted that warning signs were visible and that staff issued verbal instructions multiple times. Afterward, the park installed a physical entry barrier preventing headfirst launches. Daniel's phone was returned to his wife. The final video file ended abruptly just before the exit, cutting off mid-motion. It was May 21, 2018. A large regional amusement park outside Seoul buzzed with the energy of a Friday afternoon as thousands of visitors filled its grounds. Among them was Min-Jun Lee, a 15-year-old high school freshman standing at the bumper car pavilion with 6 classmates. Min-Jun had earned a reputation at his Seoul school for fearlessness. A competitive gymnast since age 7, he specialized in rings and parallel bars, possessing exceptional upper body strength and spatial awareness. His Snapchat showcased handstand videos atop school railings, backflips off playground equipment, and daring parkour attempts through narrow alleyways. Teachers frequently reprimanded him for dangerous stunts, but classmates found his recklessness magnetic. Bumper cars are deceptively simple attractions. Electric vehicles weighing roughly 300 pounds each navigate a conductive power grid under the arena surface, with energized contact plates at speeds reaching 8 miles per hour, controlled by riders using steering wheels and accelerator pedals. The ride operates within a metal-bordered arena, approximately 40 by 50 feet, with rubber bumpers designed to absorb collision impacts. Safety regulations strictly prohibit standing, exiting vehicles during operation, or any physical contact outside the cars. Posted warnings throughout the attraction emphasize remaining seated at all times. That afternoon, Min-Jun entered a bumper car with 2 friends while 3 others occupied nearby vehicles. The ride operator, a part-time college student managing 40 simultaneous riders, activated the 5-minute session at 3:15 in the afternoon. For the first 2 minutes, Min-Jun drove normally, ramming friends and laughing. Then he stood up inside his moving car, gripping the steering column while balancing on the seat. His friends reacted with excitement over the electric buzz and collision sounds. Min-Jun indicated to his friends that he intended to swing between 2 moving cars. Nobody stopped him. No adult noticed. The operator faced away, monitoring the timer and many riders. Min-Jun positioned his car between 2 friend-driven vehicles traveling roughly parallel at 6 miles per hour. He planted 1 foot on each car's edge, releasing his original vehicle and gripping both steering columns. For several seconds, he managed to hold the position, grinning widely as they watched the stunt. His left foot slipped on the smooth metal edge. Both hands lost grip simultaneously. Min-Jun dropped straight down into the small gap between the rubber bumper and the floor. His head struck the hard arena floor with devastating force. The impact was immediately incapacitating. Blood was visible on the arena floor. The operator heard screaming and hit the emergency stop within 4 seconds. All vehicles powered down, but some coasting motion continued before the cars came fully to rest. Min-Jun lay motionless between 2 cars, showing signs of severe head trauma. and remaining unresponsive. Park medical staff arrived within minutes, finding no pulse. More paramedics reached the scene 7 minutes later, but resuscitation attempts proved futile. The autopsy revealed catastrophic injuries. Min Jun suffered catastrophic head injuries, including skull fractures and fatal brain trauma. Death occurred within seconds of impact. The medical examiner concluded he lost consciousness immediately. The attraction was shut down pending investigation. A subsequent investigation concluded the death resulted from rider misconduct and violation of posted safety rules. No mechanical failures were identified. It was October 12, 2016, at a permanent amusement park in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. The early evening air hovered at a comfortable 72 degrees as families filled the midway during one of the park's busiest fall weekends. Decorative lights illuminated the rides as sunset approached, and the slow rotation of a large observation wheel offered elevated views of the park and surrounding city. 67-year-old Harold Williams entered the park with his wife, Margaret, as part of a long-standing tradition they had maintained throughout their marriage. Recently retired after 4 decades as an elementary school teacher, Harold had been adjusting to a quieter routine and welcomed outings that allowed him to reconnect with familiar comforts. The couple had ridden observation wheels together for years, though Harold had grown increasingly uneasy with heights following a household fall several years earlier. Despite his anxiety, Harold agreed to ride. The observation wheel stood just over 150 feet tall and featured enclosed gondolas designed to remain upright as the wheel rotated. Each car was equipped with a manually latched door and a secondary internal safety bar. Riders were instructed to remain seated and keep the door secured for the duration of the ride. As the wheel completed its first rotation, Harold appeared tense but calm. On the second ascent, as the gondola approached its highest point, he began experiencing visible distress. Margaret later reported that his breathing became labored and his posture rigid. At the peak of the ride, Harold attempted to stand, possibly believing the gondola had stopped. In doing so, he placed his weight against the door. The latch, designed to prevent accidental opening but not intended to withstand full body pressure, shifted under the load. The door opened several inches, enough to compromise Harold's balance. Margaret reached for him, but the confined space and sudden movement made it impossible to stop what followed. Harold fell forward through the partially opened doorway, dropping approximately 140 feet onto a restricted service area beneath the wheel. The impact caused catastrophic injuries incompatible with life. Ride operators halted the wheel immediately after witnesses below alerted staff. Emergency responders arrived within minutes and confirmed Harold had died at the scene due to massive blunt force trauma. Margaret was treated for shock and transported to a nearby hospital. The investigation determined that the gondola door latch met minimum operational standards, but lacked a reinforced secondary locking mechanism capable of resisting sustained force from a standing adult. Inspectors noted that while riders were instructed to remain seated, the design did not adequately account for medical distress or panic-induced movement at elevation. Authorities concluded the death was accidental. The observation wheel was shut down temporarily while additional internal restraints and reinforced door latches were installed across all gondolas. Updated procedures were also implemented, requiring operators to visually confirm that riders remained seated before each rotation continued. The park reopened the ride several weeks later under revised safety guidelines. Harold's death was cited in internal safety briefings as a case where mechanical compliance alone was insufficient to prevent a fatal outcome without accounting for human behavior under stress. It was August 9, 2015. The air inside a family entertainment center in Bangkok, Thailand, hung thick with humidity and the sharp scent of recycled air conditioning. Niran Suti, a 28-year-old delivery route supervisor, had spent his Saturday afternoon at a nephew's birthday celebration, unaware that the children's play area would become the site of a preventable death. Niran worked for a regional beverage distribution company, managing delivery schedules across Bangkok's commercial districts. Co-workers described him as outgoing and physical, someone who took jokes too far when drinking. He had consumed 3 large beers with lunch at a nearby restaurant, before arriving at the entertainment complex, a detail his sister would later confirm to investigators. His job required early mornings and long hours coordinating drivers, leaving weekends as his primary social outlet. Indoor play zones in Southeast Asia typically feature ball pits as centerpiece attractions. These are enclosed areas filled with lightweight plastic balls, designed for children to jump and play safely. Standard safety guidelines recommend pit depths between 24 and 36 inches, and in this installation the balls rested above a rigid plastic base with minimal cushioning beneath. The pits create an illusion of soft landing zones, but the shallow depth and firm foundation pose serious risks for adult body weight. That afternoon, Niran arrived at the party around 2:30 in the afternoon, visibly intoxicated according to multiple witnesses. The entertainment center's ball pit measured roughly 12 feet by 15 feet, filled with approximately 24 inches of multicolored plastic balls, resting directly on a hard plastic base. Warning signs posted in Thai and English prohibited adult entry, maximum capacity limits, and diving. Staff members were occupied with another birthday group in the arcade section, and no staff member had been assigned to actively supervise the play structure when Niran began joking loudly about jumping in. His sister told him to stop, but Niran was already climbing onto the perimeter ledge. Other parents watched but did not intervene, assuming he would step down. The ball pit appeared deceptively deep from surface level, the colorful balls concealing the shallow depth and hard base beneath. Without further warning, CCTV footage showed Niran launching himself headfirst from the elevated edge. The impact was immediate and devastating. His skull struck the rigid plastic base through the thin layer of balls. His body weight, approximately 180 pounds, drove him down with full force. He did not surface or move after entry. His torso sank face down into the balls, chest compressed against the unyielding foundation. The position prevented his ribcage from expanding, limiting his ability to breathe normally. Children continued playing around and on top of him, unaware a man lay dying beneath them for approximately 15 minutes. The balls shifted back into place after the dive, concealing his body beneath the surface. His dark clothing blended with the dim lighting inside the pit. The party area was separated from the play zone by a glass wall and filled with loud music from an adjacent celebration, further delaying recognition that something was wrong. At 3:02 in the afternoon, a group of children digging toward the bottom reached Niran's face. One 7-year-old noticed his open eyes were not blinking and alerted her mother. The parent immediately notified staff, who cleared the pit before 2 employees coordinated his removal within 3 minutes. Staff trained in CPR initiated resuscitation, while emergency services were contacted. No automated external defibrillator was available anywhere in the facility. Paramedics arrived 11 minutes later, transporting Niran to a nearby hospital, where he was pronounced dead with autopsy findings, indicating primary blunt force cranial trauma with secondary positional asphyxiation. The entertainment center permanently banned adult entry to all children's play equipment following the incident. Local authorities later cited the facility for inadequate supervision of the play area during peak occupancy hours. It was September 11, 2014. The carousel at an amusement park spun beneath the late afternoon sun, its painted horses rising and falling to cheerful organ music. 15-year-old Sina Mortensen sat astride a white stallion, her hands gripping the brass pole, unaware that the vintage ride's mechanical heart would become dangerous within minutes. Sina was a bright, energetic teenager from a suburb outside Copenhagen. Her mother, Anna, brought her to the famous amusement park as a special treat before school started the following week. Teachers described Sina as adventurous and physically confident for her age. She took weekly horseback riding lessons at a local stable and spent hours at home practicing balance games, walking along curbs and low walls with surprising coordination. That confidence, combined with a teenager's impulsive streak, likely made standing on moving objects feel less dangerous than it really was. Anna said that she had chosen the antique carousel specifically because Sina loved horses. The 1914 ride was one of Tivoli's historic attractions, featuring hand-carved wooden horses that rose and fell on brass poles. Anna watched from the platform edge, phone ready to capture photos of her daughter's excitement. The carousel completed its first rotation smoothly as Sina waved each time she passed her mother. From the control panel behind a central column that partially blocked the outer platform, the operator monitored the carousel as it rotated at roughly 5 revolutions per minute. Midway through the second rotation, witnesses later confirmed that Sina suddenly stood up on the saddle of her horse. A faded sign at the ride entrance warned riders to remain seated, but no attendant was on the platform to enforce it. The vintage carousel lacked modern safety features, including protective skirts covering the gap between the rotating platform floor and the stationary base beneath, leaving hazardous spaces exposed. She balanced momentarily on the saddle as the horse rose on its mechanical arm. Her small boots slipped on the smooth painted wood. She fell sideways, tumbling off the horse toward the outer edge of the rotating platform. The outer edge of the rotating platform left a narrow space between the moving deck and the stationary base beneath. When Sina fell from the saddle, part of her body slid off the platform and became trapped between the rotating deck frame and the stationary support structure below. The carousel continued turning as Sina's body was pinned between the rotating platform frame and the stationary support structure beneath. Anna's screams cut through the organ music. The platform completed one more full rotation, approximately 12 seconds, before the operator, whose view had been blocked by the central column and canopy, noticed movement at the platform edge and hit the emergency stop. Anna pushed through other riders, reaching the gap where Sina had disappeared. Operators crawled beneath the platform, finding Sina wedged between structural components. She was unconscious and not breathing. Copenhagen Emergency Services reached the scene shortly after. They extracted Sina carefully from the machinery, but resuscitation attempts failed. The medical examiner's preliminary report listed severe thoracic crush injuries, multiple rib fractures, and catastrophic internal trauma as cause of death. The amusement park suspended all vintage carousel operations immediately. Within 2 months, engineers installed protective safety skirts on all rotating rides, eliminating gaps large enough for children to slip through. New protocols required ride attendants to position themselves directly on platforms during operation and strictly enforced seating rules, and strict enforcement prohibited standing on any moving attraction. It was August 3, 2017, at a coastal amusement park in South Carolina. Towering steel roller coasters dominated the skyline as ride operators prepared for the evening rush. Valen Spade, a 24-year-old kitchen worker at a local seafood restaurant, had arrived with 2 co-workers before their evening shift. Known for her adventurous spirit and love of thrill rides, Valen had convinced them to squeeze in a few attractions before work. She had worked double shifts all week and was eager for the adrenaline rush that roller coasters could provide. The group approached a high-speed steel roller coaster, where riders sat in open cars, secured by individual ratcheting lap bars rather than shoulder harnesses. The restraints locked across the rider's thighs, with secondary seat belts serving as a backup. Valen chose the second row, left seat, settling into the molded seat as the operator moved down the line checking restraints. Witnesses later reported the restraints appeared properly secured when the train left the station. The operator pressed firmly on each lap bar and confirmed the seat belts before signaling the all clear. Investigators later noted that during the check, Valen had slightly lifted her hips and arched her back while laughing with her co-workers, a posture that can create extra space beneath the lap bar if the rider settles lower afterward. The train began its climb up the 112-foot lift hill, anti-rollback dogs clicking rhythmically against the track. At the top, riders could see the Atlantic Ocean before the train plunged downward at 56 miles per hour. After the first drop, the train sped through several high-speed turns before climbing a large camelback hill designed to create strong airtime, the sensation of weightlessness that briefly lifts riders from their seats. Several riders later reported seeing Valen lifting her arms and shifting inside the seat while laughing. Witnesses said she repeatedly tried to lift her hips and lean forward and sideways beneath the lap bar as the train climbed the hill. Investigators later determined the lap bar was resting higher than recommended on her thighs, leaving a larger than normal gap between the restraint and her body. Although the secondary seatbelt was fastened, it had enough slack to allow limited movement if a rider repeatedly lifted their hips. As the train crested the camelback hill, Powerful negative G-forces briefly lifted riders upward. In Valen's case, the extra space beneath the restraint allowed her hips and torso to rise upward and partially sideways past the edge of the lap bar. As the train accelerated down the far side of the hill, she was ejected from the train. She fell roughly 45 feet, striking a steel support beam before landing on a concrete service path beneath the ride structure. Operators immediately shut down the coaster and cleared guests from the surrounding area. Emergency responders confirmed fatal injuries caused by severe head and spinal trauma from the fall. Inspectors later confirmed that the restraint system was functioning normally and had passed its safety checks. Investigators concluded the restraint had been positioned higher on her body at dispatch, and her repeated movements beneath the lap bar created enough space for her to slip free during the ride's strong airtime hill. The park issued a statement reminding visitors that restraints must remain fully secured and riders must stay seated at all times. Officials later described the incident as a tragic example of how ignoring basic ride safety rules can turn a thrill ride into a fatal mistake. It was May 21, 2016, when 22-year-old Trevor Benson made his way to Midway Heights Amusement Park in Branson, Missouri, with his younger sister and 2 friends for an evening of thrill rides before closing time. Trevor worked in retail and was known for his easygoing nature and willingness to try any ride. His sister Kayla, a 19-year-old coffee shop worker with boundless energy, had convinced the group to squeeze in one more adventure as the sun began to set. Joining them were Marcus, a 23-year-old landscaper whose calm demeanor made him the voice of reason, and Dana, a 24-year-old retail associate whose organized personality meant she always kept track of everyone's belongings. The group targeted the park's towering drop ride, which stood over 200 feet tall. The queue was short as most families had already headed home, leaving mainly teenagers and young adults seeking that final adrenaline rush. What the riders couldn't have known was that maintenance had been performed earlier that day on the restraint switch bank. One of the seats in Trevor's row had been tagged as temporarily unavailable, but the tag was removed later that afternoon, after a shift supervisor authorized its return to service following a brief function test. In an effort to maximize capacity during the busy evening period, the operations team cleared the row for use despite no formal sign-off from the maintenance lead. This particular drop tower model was designed without secondary seat belts, relying solely on over-the-shoulder restraints and position sensors to ensure rider safety. When Trevor was seated in an outer position, the operator performed the standard push-check procedure, and his harness appeared to latch properly. However, the restraint had engaged at a higher clearance than normal, which should have been caught by the position sensor. The gondola began its steady ascent, carrying 20 riders toward the peak. Light wind gusts remained within operational limits, and the ride's computer system showed all green lights. At the top, the gondola briefly rotated to face the midway below before the countdown began. When the solenoids fired and freefall initiated, the sudden transition to negative G-forces created upward forces on all riders' bodies. For most passengers, properly fitted restraints easily contained these forces. However, Trevor's miscalibrated position sensor had allowed his restraint to engage with an excessive chest gap that the system incorrectly registered as safe. The peak negative acceleration during the initial drop caused Trevor's torso to rise above the shoulder wings of his restraint. Though the ratcheting mechanism remained technically latched, the starting position had been so far out of specification that his pelvis cleared the seat pan entirely. Trevor separated from the gondola early in the drop, following a ballistic trajectory that intersected with one of the tower's cross braces before he fell to the exclusion zone below. The remaining riders experienced the programmed deceleration sequence and came to a normal stop at the base. The ride operators remained at their positions as protocol demanded, immediately implementing lockout procedures while emergency services were summoned. When paramedics arrived, they quickly determined that Trevor had sustained unsurvivable multi-system trauma, including skull fractures, massive internal injuries, and catastrophic hemorrhaging. The investigation focused on the restraint position sensor calibration and the decision to return the previously tagged seat to service. Marcus later provided investigators with crucial details about observing another rider's restraint, requiring multiple attempts to latch properly. The tower was immediately secured and removed from operation, pending a complete forensic analysis. State inspectors and manufacturer engineers were notified, and the control system was sealed for evidence. It was July 27, 2015. The afternoon crowds at a seaside amusement pier in southern England moved lazily between game stalls and food vendors, the summer heat making everyone sluggish except for two teenage workers who had clocked out early. Callum Johnson Reed, 18, and Josh Jefferson, 17, stood beneath the towering Ferris wheel, plotting their next stunt in what would become their final act of reckless bravado. Callum worked the ring toss booth, while Josh operated the bumper cars, both earning minimum wage through a seasonal employment agency that staffed the pier's attractions. Friends described them as inseparable troublemakers, who treated their summer jobs as extended opportunities for dangerous pranks. They'd been caught sneaking onto rides after hours, climbing restricted areas of roller coasters, and performing increasingly risky stunts. Ferris wheels operate as massive rotating structures reaching heights of roughly 130 to 160 feet, with passenger gondolas suspended from the outer rim that rely on primary mechanical latches backed by gravity and secondary safety catches. Designed for slow, methodical rotation that typically takes 10 to 12 minutes per cycle. The pier's Ferris wheel had been experiencing mechanical issues all summer. Maintenance logs showed repeated complaints about a stiff and partially misaligned gondola door latch, particularly on Gondola 7. Staff had reported the problem to management 3 times in the past month, but repairs were repeatedly delayed due to cost concerns and the busy summer season. The wheel continued operating with a posted warning for riders to ensure doors were properly secured, rather than removing the gondola from service, which violated internal maintenance recommendations. That afternoon, Callum and Josh decided to ride the wheel during their break, specifically requesting Gondola 7 because they knew about the faulty latch. Security cameras covering the loading platform and lower support structure captured them entering the gondola at 2:45 p.m., leaning their combined weight repeatedly against the door, an action subtle enough to avoid immediate operator intervention. Other riders in nearby gondolas later reported hearing loud banging and shouting from their direction. At the wheel's highest point, approximately 90 to 100 feet above the pier, their repeated leaning finally overcame the compromised latch, allowing the door to swing partially open. The sudden shift in balance caused both teenagers to stumble forward. Security footage shows Josh losing his footing first and falling cleanly through the opening, while Callum became momentarily caught on the doorframe as he followed. Josh struck the pavement after a roughly 3-second fall, dying instantly. Callum's fall was interrupted when his loose hoodie snagged on a fixed structural bracket near the gondola's mounting arm, pinning his upper torso and compressing his neck and chest. Witnesses watched in horror as he struggled briefly, his body partially suspended and pressed against the metal framework, while the wheel continued moving only a few feet before the operator initiated an emergency stop. His movements weakened rapidly, ceasing within 30 to 45 seconds as oxygen deprivation set in. The ride operator, alerted by screaming bystanders and abnormal gondola movement, stopped the wheel and called emergency services. Rescue teams arrived within 6 minutes, but required specialized equipment to reach Callum's body safely. Josh was pronounced dead at the scene from massive blunt force trauma and multiple fractures. Callum died from compressive asphyxia involving neck and upper chest compression, the medical examiner confirming rapid loss of consciousness consistent with restricted airflow and blood flow. The pier immediately closed the Ferris wheel and removed Gondola 7 from service, later eliminating the exposed structural bracket and replacing all door latch assemblies. Callum's parents filed a civil claim for damages after maintenance records revealed the known latch defects. The case resulted in a substantial settlement, regulatory fines, and mandatory third-party safety audits, with expanded shutdown authority granted to maintenance staff across all pier attractions. It was September 9, 2017, at a regional amusement park outside Bengaluru, India, where a company outing packed the grounds as heat lingered and high-intensity rides dispatched full seats non-stop. Rohit Malhotra, 29, worked in mobile phone retail in Bengaluru. handling warranty issues and customer complaints through long, crowded shifts. He lived at home, helped with expenses, and set aside small savings for a future business course. His heavier build often made restraint checks difficult on high-intensity rides, something he had encountered before but usually laughed off. During a company outing to the park, Rohit decided he wanted to ride one of the thrill attractions. When he was seated on the pendulum ride, the restraint indicator stayed red, signaling an improper fit due to load limits. The operator told him to exit. With co-workers watching and the ride moments from dispatch, Rohit argued to try again, unwilling to step away and be singled out. After stepping back into the seat, Rohit adjusted himself repeatedly. Surveillance footage later showed him forcing the shoulder restraint down hard until it clicked once. The harness appeared secure, but it had only partially engaged and was not fully locked into position. The operator performed a visual check, saw the green indicator and the harness sitting down on his shoulders, and cleared the seat for dispatch. Rohit settled back into the seat as the cycle began. The ride launched immediately. It was one of the park's most aggressive attractions, swinging riders more than 100 feet while inverting them repeatedly. The restraint system depended on precise sensor calibration and full locking engagement. Because Rohit had forced the harness into a false partial lock rather than achieving a proper fit, the restraint was not fully engaged. It sat high on his shoulders, leaving excess vertical space. As the pendulum gained speed, centrifugal force lifted Rohit's body upward. On the first full rise, the restraint shifted instead of holding firm. His hips lifted above the seat edge. When the ride inverted, gravity pulled his upper body through the gap beneath the harness. By the peak of the swing, his legs cleared the seat entirely, and he slipped free. Rohit was ejected feet first, then rotated backward by the momentum of the arm. He struck a fixed steel maintenance stair platform positioned beneath the ride's swing path. His head hit the metal edge at speed, producing a sharp impact heard across the ride area. His body fell to the concrete below and remained motionless. Blood spread quickly beneath his head and along the base of the stairs. The ride continued its programmed cycle for roughly 40 seconds, gradually slowing rather than stopping abruptly. Riders screamed as they passed overhead, clearly seeing Rohit's body below. Staff activated the emergency stop, which reduced power but did not halt the ride instantly, consistent with pendulum ride design. Security pushed back onlookers and sealed the area. Medical staff reached Rohit within minutes. He was unresponsive, with visible skull fractures and massive bleeding. There was no pulse or breathing. Paramedics arrived approximately 7 minutes later and pronounced him dead at the scene. The post-mortem listed catastrophic blunt force head trauma as the cause of death. The skull fractures caused immediate brain failure, making survival impossible. No alcohol or drugs were present. The restraint showed incomplete locking. Video evidence confirmed deliberate forcing of the restraint into a partial lock before dispatch. Investigators cited unsafe rider interference with the restraint system as the primary factor. Rohit's parents later filed a civil case against the park. It was July 15, 2014, at a regional amusement park outside Sandusky, Ohio. By mid-morning, heat and humidity had already settled over the property as summer crowds filled the walkways. The park's newest attraction, a steel roller coaster called Iron Viper, dominated the skyline near the rear section of the grounds. Rising just over 170 feet, the ride had opened earlier that season and was marketed as the park's most intense experience to date. Daniel Morales, 34, entered the park shortly after opening with his two daughters, ages 8 and 10. He worked as a construction foreman and was known among co-workers for being meticulous about safety procedures. This trip had taken nearly a year of saving and planning, and it was the girls' first visit to a large amusement park. Both children met the posted height requirement for Iron Viper, though the younger of the two cleared it by less than an inch. As they moved through the queue, Daniel paid close attention to ride operations. Trains were dispatched every 2 minutes, with attendants visually checking over the shoulder restraints before each departure. The ride used a ratcheting restraint system designed to lock automatically when pulled down, paired with a secondary seatbelt. Due to high guest volume that morning, attendants were moving quickly to maintain throughput. The family was seated in the third row of a 7-car train. Daniel ensured both children's restraints were lowered, tugging on them before securing his own. Unknown to riders, one restraint sensor on that train had been intermittently misreading its locked position during earlier cycles. In addition, wear inside the restraint's ratcheting mechanism prevented the locking teeth from fully seating, a condition that had not yet triggered a system fault, allowing the train to continue operating. The train ascended the lift hill without incident. At the crest, it slowed briefly before tipping into the initial drop, where the train reached speeds exceeding 65 miles per hour. As the force of the descent pressed riders into their seats, Daniel's restraint shifted upward several inches. The faulty sensor and worn locking components allowed the restraint to appear secured, despite never achieving full mechanical engagement. Near the bottom of the first drop, the sudden change in forces caused the restraint to lose effective engagement under load. Daniel was lifted from his seat and thrown forward within the car. His upper body struck the steel edge of the restraint frame before he was partially ejected from the train, remaining entangled only briefly before falling into a fenced maintenance access area beneath the track. Ride operators initiated an emergency stop within seconds, as witnesses along the track alerted staff. The train came to a halt further along the course, and riders were evacuated. Park emergency teams reached the impact area quickly and began life-saving measures. Daniel was found unresponsive with catastrophic head and chest injuries. He was transported to a nearby trauma center, but was pronounced dead shortly after arrival due to severe blunt force trauma. His daughters were physically unharmed and were treated for shock. The subsequent investigation determined the cause was a restraint locking failure linked to a faulty position sensor that had not been detected during morning checks. Inspectors concluded the accident was preventable and ordered the immediate shutdown of Iron Viper. The ride remained closed pending regulatory review, mechanical redesign, and updated inspection procedures across the park.